Thank you, Leah and Charles. I'm delighted to be here tonight. I was contacted by Charles, must have been at least a year ago, maybe longer, maybe a year ago, because they were curating this exhibition, and they've subsequently asked me to speak on my project, which was just held up. It's the end point of the project. There were other little bits and pieces as well, but I won't go into that part of the project. So it's really great to be in this context in a house museum and talking to you all this evening. What I'm going to do is talk really about how feminism's made a difference through artists and the art world to get to where we're at today, which is considerably better off than where we were at in the 1960s. So I'm going to start with quoting a couple of artists from the 60s and early 70s, and then look at some statistics, because I personally don't enjoy statistics very much, but they do show us quantitatively kind of what's happened. And it also shows us as Australians how Australian women and scholars have been doing those statistics over the time. But I'm not going to dwell on them too much. And then I'm going to move through and talk primarily based in the art, but with a real mindfulness of how feminism has shifted and changed within itself, within our world, within the history of ideas, to where we are at the moment, which I think at the moment we're in, for feminism and women's art, we're in a very sophisticated and very nuanced space, which I think is really interesting at the moment. Personally, I don't care how much the artwork costs. I don't think that's necessarily a great indicator of whether a work is going to survive through history. And we all know that from looking at art history. It's often the work that gets missed out that actually becomes significant over time. But anyway, so here's my little pointer. I'm going to start with, which way are we going, that way? I'm going to start with Erica McGilchrist, who was Melbourne-based. Very famous picture of hers called The Embrace from 1964. And Janet R. Brodie, who was an artist that I discovered in my project. I hadn't heard from her before, hadn't heard of her, hadn't seen her in the art history much. So this is something, a little bit about Erica McGilchrist. Erica did a lot to foster and promote women's art in Australia through her involvement with the women's rights movement, and in 1975 she co-established the first nationally recognised Women's Art Register, WAR, which was an information research source profiling and recording Australian-based female artists from the 1840s to the present. So her role at as the Women's Art Register's kind of volunteer coordinator, which she did from 78 to 86, really brought focus on the marginal status of women's creative work within that wider culture at the time. So she was very, very pioneering. The Women's Art Register continues, of course. It was at the Carringbush Library. I think it might still be there, but they're looking for a bigger venue, I think, at the moment. And Janet R. Brodie stuck in my mind because when I started the project, I just put out a huge expression of interest, kind of mailing through all sorts of artist spaces, the Women's Art Register, galleries, wherever, to ask women to express their interest in being in the project. This meant that I subsequently had, over 800 or 900 people that wanted to be in it, plus I had to backfill that with all the people that were already established in the history of art from the time. So you can imagine the editing job was heartbreaking. But Janet's work really stood out in my mind for her artist statement, and I'm just going to read you a little bit of it. And she says, I did not, in 1964, have the required secondary school qualifications to attend the National Gallery School. John Brack said, "You seem to be doing all right in your own studio." He suggested I come to life drawing there, which I did informally. At the University of Melbourne, I attended art history lectures by Professor Joseph Burke. In 1965, Stan Rapatak set up a special masterclass of 6 at the University of New England Summer School, to which I was invited and participated over a period of 4 years, from 65 to 68. I sold several large paintings there, and Rapatak, who is incredibly famous as an abstract gestural artist, and his master classes would have been very, very significant. So he arranged an exhibition for the artists in his masterclass, and that's how she sold some paintings. And in 1968, and fired with this ambition, she goes on and says, I approached the Rudy Coleman Gallery, where Rudy said, "You're unknown, you're young, and you're a woman." And King Benithan from South Yarra Gallery and the Australian Gallery gave much the same response, but not so blunt. So that's how, and Janet is now way into her 90s and can only just continue to paint, but has maintained quite a significant career as a kind of abstract as an abstract painter. So I just wanted to start with those 2 artists, one obviously a bit of an activist, Erica McGilchrist, and the other a woman that's become known to us through her sheer persistence, but was obviously right up there in the avant-garde, recognised by her colleague painters, but outside the system didn't believe, like the gallerists didn't believe, they could give her a chance in their galleries at that time because she was young and she was a woman. You wouldn't get that response today. So here's some of the statistics. This is the Women's Art Register survey from 1980 to 85, showing the percentages of artists in the art schools, which is always used as a kind of a significant number, because you look at the artists in art school and then you look at the ones that continue to exhibit, and the numbers for women are low. And then you look at things like, I think we've got it here, the number of women that get reviewed. This is in The Age. I don't know how much real art historical influence The Age has, but it is in terms of who knows whom about which artists in the community. It's significant, and you see that women are consistently getting less space in the newspaper. This is a later one in 1992, and you can see if you read the things at the bottom again, it's who was in the art schools, who said that they were artists in that census, then who are exhibiting, reviewed, and so on, and how much space they get. So these are the kind of statistics that people have been concerned about. Okay. Where people get exhibited is important, and I'm starting probably with, in terms of the history of contemporary art in Australia, the exhibition The Field has probably been the most written about art historically, because it's seen to be a highly influential, we might disagree with this now, but in the art historical canon, it is seen to be a highly influential exhibition, which was curated, of course, to open Roy Grounds' new building for the National Gallery of Victoria in Melbourne. And it took its name from the colour field movement in America and included works by a generation of young artists painting hard edge and geometric abstraction as well as colour field. It only included 3 women, Wendy Paramore, Normana White and Janet Dawson, who I'm showing you here. But it's a very significant exhibition, and what it tried to do was to position Australian abstract painting on an international and avant-garde agenda. So whatever we might think about, you know, who was in the show, whether the artists were used as pawns in games, these are all sorts of arguments that have come forward. Nevertheless, the desire by the curators was to position an avant-garde in Australia, which is significant however we want to. And to a certain extent it was. Because of all the literature that's been written about it, it was very successful. This is Leslie Dumbrell, who is a later artist, but also collected by the NGV as soon as this painting was exhibited, well, the year after they collected it. So who gets in what shows, who gets collected by major exhibitions, these are key items in terms of establishing artists' credentials in the mainstream. And I'll underline that, mainstream. I'm just going to... This is Elvis Richardson, because where we are at with statistics now is we tend to go to Elvis Richardson's work because she's established the Countess program, the blog site, the Countess, and you can just go Countess website and it comes up with lots of statistical information. This is her own artwork where she's showing us art in Australia, men 2010, women 2012. You can see the stacks are getting more even. Well, that was Elvis. Oh, it is Elvis. Yes, you can see. I can't see. I'm at a oblique angle. I should sit here. And this is the kind of work that Countess has been doing. So, as I said before, I'm not really a statistically based researcher, primarily because raw numbers only tell us some quantitative things and statistics, but statistics can be useful. This is because an artist's exhibition and publication history is important, as I said before, as key indicators of success on their CV, if you like. And it's particularly true of esteemed survey exhibitions, like the Field, for example, and curated surveys of artists in public and private galleries. So if a young emerging artist gets into something like, I'm just going to flick through some of these slides, something like the Biennale of Sydney, for example, it opens a lot of doors for them in the future. And you've got to think of, you know, what kind of possibilities, what kind of potential artists are getting to show exactly how good their work is, if you like. Like if artists aren't getting on the right platforms and if they're not invited to the right parties, put it like that, then they're not getting on the right agendas to get success. And the work that Countess has done has shown us that this is from their 2019 report, that things are getting a lot better for women than they were in the 70s and certainly in the 60s. So Countess really follows in the footsteps of, or follows on from the quantitative work that earlier feminists are doing, specifically Linda Nocklin's foundational essay, which many of you will have read, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists, which was first published in 1971 and has been republished over and over in lots of collections since. It's considered to be the first major work of feminist art history. So we can see here, art fairs, we're doing pretty good. The National Gallery of Australia is doing particularly badly, what it was in 2019. They tried to address that with an exhibition I'll talk about in a minute. And you can see the biennales where artists are exhibiting is becoming, you know, it's equalling up a lot more. So that's firstly what the statistics show us, is things are a lot better than they used to be. And from the mid to late 70s, what happens is there is a surge of feminist art activism and scholarship and archivist work which gets us to this point. This is basically one of my, there's many arguments going through that book, but that's one of the arguments. So, and what we see happening at that time is that feminism and women's culture gets put on the agenda in the universities as an academic discipline in its own right. And we're going to start with how that gets going. So this is the very famous philosophy strike at the University of Sydney in 1973. Which was the result, so the philosophy department was the first department to strike because of the cancellation of a women's studies course in that department. So at that time there was only a course in a department of philosophy. And the academics in that department decided in 1973 they'd have enough of this ratbag course and they were going to cancel it. So the strike then spread through the humanities and was supported by the Builders Labourers Federation, which scared the university because they threatened to ban all work on the university campus. And anybody that's ever been an academic knows that one thing you can't do is to stop building buildings on your university, because that's seems to be the prime indicator of the university's success, what they call estates. It's very important to them. So with the Builders Labourers behind them, the strike was very successful and women's studies was introduced in the university as its own program. So the first centre of women's studies was established at the University of Sydney. The other thing I said about statistics, and I'm going to stop with this in a minute, is who gets in what book. So I did a very quick survey in about 2016 when I was starting to think about doing this project, of the major texts like Bernard Smith's Australian Painting, several editions of that, Australian Sculptors, some of these major works. I put my book in, which was a bit conceited, which was Contemporary Australian Photography since 2000, when was it? Since 1980, which was male and females in that book, to see how I was figuring, because I wasn't quite sure, because I wasn't counting heads either at that stage, to see how my book figured in relation to the others. And you can see that really it's just astonishing the small amount of women and also Indigenous artists who are so prolific that are actually getting in these major monographs, which is, you know, these are key texts for students in universities, so it was pretty appalling. If you look at it that way, it's even worse. Look at the Indigenous representation in those big books, and they're major books, you know. Anyway. So I want to leave the statistics and just trying to prove a point that things are better now, that there are various things that people have to do to get success in the mainstream. And to look at the way that feminist history, art history developed in Australia from the 70s onwards, and I want to do this by starting with the emerging avant-garde that saw mainstream modernist paradigms being critiqued by Western artists internationally. So it's not just women that are critiquing these paradigms, but the avant-garde's critiquing them as well, albeit sometimes from a misogynist point of view, but we will put that to one side for a while. But what feminist art history tried to do, and certainly in Australia this was the case as well, was to influence what was happening in the avant-garde, which was a very good strategy, I think. So whilst the field in 1968, that exhibition we started with, clearly positioned abstract painting as the avant-garde in Australia, many historians see the period from 68 to 72 as a changing of the guard. And I'm going to follow this trajectory tonight as a way of explaining how women started to contest the male dominance in art, exhibitions and publishing. And this is what I'm showing you tonight. It's just a snapshot really, but it shows how women's art and feminist critical theory infiltrated and then changed the avant-garde of the late 70s and 1980s, and then going forward, the postmodern and contemporary art followed. So I'm starting here with very famous suite of works by Mike Parr and Peter Kennedy called Idea Demonstrations at Inhibitors in 1971. Oh, I've gone check date and then I've got the date, 1971. It is nice. Anyway, and very influential works that put the kind of performative avant-garde on the agenda in Sydney. So in the 1970s, the avant-garde was certainly male-dominated, and it was dubbed by feminist art historians in America as male and pale. And news of the protests in America reached Australia through publications like Heresies and Art Forum and groups like Art and Language. We had artists involved in Art and Language. They were going to America, New York and Europe. They were coming back. They were talking about it. And other artists, groups that were emerging at the time in America and through Europe. So Artists Meeting for Cultural Change, which Lucy Lippard was very involved in, and the Art Workers Coalition. Which kind of merged into the Art Workers Union, which we still have, well, it's called a different name, it's quite institutionalised now, but and also the Progressive Art Movement, which was a Maoist-run kind of organisation here in Australia, and the Women's Art Movement as well, as it manifested in Australia. So Peter Kennedy and Mike Parr are already associated with Lucy Lippard in New York when they're starting to do this work. They were in her very influential book called 6 Years, The Dematerialisation of the Art Object, which came out in 1973 and was essential reading for the avant-garde, especially because this famous duo, plus Tim Johnson, who was also involved in Inhibitors, were in this book. So these artists stayed in touch with Lippard as a contact for them in New York, and this kind of gets the ball rolling. Now, there were very few women involved in Inhibitors. Barbara Hall who was active but in a different role. She was actually Peter Kennedy's partner at the time, so, you know, she was doing all the assistant type work for them. But she notes that very few women actually got a hold in Inhibitors in the early 70s, with the exception of Philippa Cullen, who unfortunately died prematurely in 1975. So we haven't known a lot about Philippa Cullen until relatively recently, because a fellow called Stephen Jones, who's probably got the best archive in the world on Australian early video art, and this work is video work, video performance. He had got a lot of documentation of her work from that time, and subsequently they've put on a retrospective exhibition in Sydney. So that was down to Stephen's archive. So there's a kind of problematic but still fruitful relation between early feminist art history, women artists, and this male and pale avant-garde. That's where the things start to get interesting. This is a much later kind of retrospective analysis of Lucy Lippard's talk that she gave in Australia in the 70s by Di Smith and Kelly Doley, who were part of, I'm going to call them by the wrong name, Barbara Cleveland Incorporated. They used to be called Brown Council, but they changed their names. So going back to Lippard and this connection with the avant-garde, it wasn't until International Women's Year in Australia in 1975 that Lucy Lippard herself turned her attention to female artists in Australia. She was commissioned that year to do the prestigious Power Lecture at the University of Sydney, and she subsequently toured the country and spread the news of the political strategies that were evolving from America through the Western world, which was called the East-West bag, and what that did was to encourage women to set up women's art registers to document their work, so to document the work of the women that weren't getting the same advantages as men were getting or were going to be forgotten, if you like. So we know that women's art movements had already been formed in Sydney, Melbourne and Adelaide by the mid-70s, so it wasn't like Lucy Lippard was coming here from America and, you know, pioneering great things. Women here had already started this rolling, so Lippard comes and kind of is kind of the icing on the cake, if you like. I mean, some people say, you know, Lippard brought feminist art history to Australia. Well, that's bullshit, because it was already here. And there were already people curating really big women's shows that were celebrating women's art, and were often open curated shows. So anybody that actually applied to be in the exhibition got in the exhibition. These were massive kind of shows. So there was the Women's Show in 1977 and the Lovely Motherhood Show in 79, which were these really big blockbuster shows, which would, you know, include all comers, if you like. Now, probably the most significant point about these shows, especially the Women's Show in 77, was that it was curated by a collective of over 50 women. Now, anybody that's been in a collective will know that a collective of 50 people is going to be problematic. So this gave a voice to a really wide range of women, but it wasn't without its organisational problems. And what I want to do through this talk tonight too is to try to shed light on the problems within feminism as it's developed, and then how it's addressed those, and how it's kind of fractured and exploded and imploded on itself in interesting ways. So something like the Women's Show relied on not only the 50 in the node kind of people on the collectives, but also a huge tribe of volunteers who were needed to facilitate the exhibitions. As you can imagine, very big arguments and discussions were had within this collective concerning power. And when Julie Ewington writes about this, Julie Ewington is a significant curator and scholar in this field, in the post-event publication. So she's writing this after the Women's Show in 1977, so it's early. She says that the issues that arose during that time were about sexuality, artist work, like the paid work of artists, and politics. Now, I'd suggest it's the same now. These issues are still resonating in these areas. So the issues were about artist labour and work rights, and the politics of sexuality within the collectives and the volunteer programs. Now, more recently, Rosie Brugdotti, who's an expatriate Australian scholar now living in the Netherlands, and probably one of the key theorists of new materialism, which we'll end on in a minute, well, not in a minute, but soon, has also not acknowledged that in the 21st century within feminism, a radicalisation of feminist philosophies taking place through a recognition of the priority of sexuality and the relevance of the sex-gender distinction. And we all know that this is very current in our culture at the moment. It's evident through the increase in activity and publication from the LGBTQI+ community, and the explosion of queer and gender studies in the universities, which has taken over from women's studies. So woman as an object of academic focus, for example, has slipped, and we're now looking at gender studies in the universities and queer studies. So this is a shift that's happened inside feminism in our lifetimes. So in this section what I want to do is to look at works by female performance artists or performative artists from the 70s and early 80s and consider how they addressed and challenged the male avant-garde. So here we have Tim Johnson on the right-hand side in a famous performance where he's dusting and tickling his wife, and Melanie Howard, who we don't know very much about. She's an artist who's now fairly forgotten. Tim Johnson's wife, who is unnamed in the performance, of course, was Vivian Johnson, who went on to become a significant art historian of Aboriginal art. So what Melanie Howard has done in her performance is she has empowered about 12 men, colleagues of hers, who were associated, she was working out of the Experimental Art Foundation in Adelaide. She's empowered them by giving them the single Rolex, single lens camera, an analogue camera, and a roll of film, and she's told them they can tell her to do anything, and she'll do anything they want, and they can take photographs of her. And they were all, you know, all of them were very stereotypically putting her in these kind of positions. And I think it's probably one of the very early works that starts to talk about the male gaze, which we'll get to in a sec. So that's that one. And then again I'm using Howard, one of her portraits. This is, you know, all these portraits of the woman done by the male photographers, and a little known work by Noel Sheridan, who was the director of the Experimental Art Foundation at the time, and a very charismatic performer. And what he's doing here is he's standing in front of a fridge which is displaying the Maoist flag, and there are all of these projections happening on the fridge, and the fridge is also graffitied. Now the fridge was housed in a group inhabited by male avant-gardists associated with the Experimental Art Foundation, and what Sheridan did was to present the graffiti on the fridge itself and via projections, and what this graffiti in this male household did was to write all their sexual kind of conquests that they'd had with women, and they'd name the women in the art world that they'd had these conquests with, and they would explain them in graphic detail for their mates. So this was their kind of... So but what we see most prominently, of course, is this Maoist flag, and this is a direct reference to the progressive art movement, who was on the board of the Experimental Art Foundation, and they'd wanted to ban this work. They'd wanted it to be eliminated from this performance festival that Sheridan was going to put it in. So in Sheridan's mind, his work was being censored. So he subsequently made this performance called Beyond the Fridge, and he said it was about basically anti-censorship of the arts. So juxtaposed with, you know, what's also happening around the same time, a couple of years earlier, these male artists are making these images of Melanie Howard. Now, this kind of thing was rife at the time with the male and pale avant-garde. And in America, this is a very famous example of how Linda Benglis gets her own back at Robert Morris in the pages of Art Forum. And it's become legendary in the art world because Benglis couldn't get her, so this was on the front cover of Art Forum, the Morris, and she couldn't get her picture where she's doing the sexual prowess, S&M, whatever thing, with her dildo, her fake dildo. She couldn't get that in as an artwork into Art Forum. They wouldn't have it because she was a woman wearing a dildo, and it was 1974. So she snuck it in as an advert. And unfortunately, well, probably fortunately, Rosalind Krauss is one of the most well-known art historians in the Western world, especially during the postmodern period, or she's a modernist, but you know, she became famous during the postmodern period. She was absolutely incensed that Linda Benglis had got it across the editorial board by putting it in as an advert. So it was a really subversive avant-garde thing to do, to pay to have her work put in as an advert. And what Rosalind Krauss did was to walk out of Art Forum and subsequently create the journal October, and declare it would have absolutely no advertising in it ever. And it would be this, you know, a fantastic journal. And of course it became the journal of the postmodern era that brought post-structuralism to America, and some would say to the rest of the English-speaking world. But we now question the monopoly that that journal had, certainly in Australia, but in America, and the genesis of the journal as we come to see this rather conservative side of some of the people that were associated with it. Anyway, that's a bit of an aside. So back to the main frame of how different forms of feminist approaches to the arts. So this is the famous work by Judy Chicago from 1979, the dinner party, with big dinner party placements on the left-hand side, not a great slide, unfortunately, and one of the ceramic plates that were made with this famous central core imagery that looked like vaginas, basically. Now, Chicago's central core imagery becomes very significant for what's become known as cultural feminism, in that it's clearly celebrating the biological difference of the female form from the male form. So if you think of Benglis putting on her dildo, and then you look at Judy Chicago doing this kind of real celebration of the feminine, the female. And this has become known, it was being criticised as being essentialist, that it's essentially reducing woman to her biological attributes, if you like. So, where am I at? And this kind of approach was also apparent in some activist work within cultural feminism as well, and this approach was subsequently criticised. But I'll get to that, because we need to go a little bit further with this. So out of America comes Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party, and her very influential book, which was called Through the Flower, My Struggle as a Female Artist, which was published in '77, the year after Lucy Lippard, who might be representing the other side of the divide, if you like, published From the Centre, women's essays on, feminist essays on women's art. So there's this cultural feminism coming out of America, which is focusing on in this kind of way. And what happens in Australia is, because this argument is so dominant, you know, central core imaging equals the new feminist art equals the glorification of the female body, Vivienne Binz's becomes the cover girl, if you like, for early feminist art in Australia, because feminist art historians pick up on these paintings. Well, usually they only pick up on the one on the left, Vag Dens of 1967, and they forget all about poor old Phallic Monument of 1966, which was the first one in a trilogy. The other one was more abstract work. So Chicago's doing this work in '79. Vivienne Binz is doing central core imagery, arguably, well, according to Australian feminist scholars. She's doing it much earlier, in 1967. So we're up there. So Binns talks about this work really candidly about how she came to make this work. She did what she calls it, the penis painting first, and then she did vag dens, and she really worried about putting the teeth, making it into a vagina dentata. She worried about that, but decided it was the right thing to do in the end. But this is where feminism gets a little bit unstuck with Vivian Binns, I think, anyway. I mean, Binns does go on and do some more feminist work, but basically Vivian Binns is a virtuoso painter. She just had a huge retrospective, I think it was out at Monash Gallery here, Monash University Gallery, and at the MCA it's currently on. There's a big book out about it. It's dominated by painting. She's not really a community artist, which is how feminism likes to talk about it, or definitely not a central core artist. But what happens in this reading is that in a way, and Vivian would say to this herself to this day, in a way Vivian Binns gets misread by early feminist art history in Australia, because when she was painting Vag Dens and Phallic Monument and other works, she was part of, or in association with, the Annandale Imitation Realists in Sydney. In fact, she was having a relationship with Mike Brown at the time, and so she was very much within the core of these avant-garde pop artists. So she was embedded in the social liberation of her times, the 1960s, profoundly anti-establishment and critical of the international avant-garde, like which had been represented by abstract expressionism, colour field, hard edge abstraction that was, celebrated in the Field exhibition. But what the pop artists were on about, especially Australians, was a much rougher, a much less formalist approach to art that mined visual culture in all sorts of ways, and you can see the hippie culture being mined here, for popular imagery and different kind of techniques. And Binns has been on about this all through her lifetime. So we could read them differently. We could read Vivian Binns differently, which might have canonised her in art history quicker than trying to establish her as a central core imagery artist, of which she only does the one painting, and argue that really she was a radical pop artist and that this was the beginning of postmodernism in Australia. So if you can see the nuances of what happens when artists are too quickly harnessed to a particular reading. So it's definitely breaking sexual and conventional stereotypes, but it's probably doing so from a liberationist kind of position rather than a central core imagery position that hadn't crossed Vivian's mind for sure. We've done that bit. Okay. Right. So. What I'm going to argue is that that central core imagery, which is, in my mind anyway, a bit of a furphy, certainly gets put on the agenda by American cultural feminists, but it's too easy, and too easy is probably not it. It's just a convenient kind of, or well, I think it's not an easy read, too simplistic a read of what was really engaging at the time, and I think we have to wait until Julie Rapp in 1982 to see the next big shift. So there's this trajectory is talking about cultural feminism and celebrating the female and women's shows and all of this kind of stuff. But feminism doesn't get really hard-headed about what it's doing until the 80s. And I think this is a result of feminist women's studies and feminist studies going into the universities, and a more sophisticated critical agenda being made around how the art's being made. So the cultural feminist approach, I guess what I'm arguing is not the only critical position that emerges out of the 1970s. By the mid to late 70s, the way in which the gendered subject, if we call it that, was constructed in a patriarchal culture was starting to be reassessed. And this gave rise to a lot of photo montage and photo text works which addressed the politics of representation. And Julie Rapp is probably one of the first female artists in Australia to start to put herself in the picture as both the subject, while she is also the active maker of that meaning. So she's really obviously read Laura Mulvey's essay on the male gaze, which came out in 1975. Artists were really keen on reading film theorists because the film theorists were really into the shifts that were happening in critical theory. They were very switched on about what was happening with photography in the camera and the power positions in the camera, and Susan Sontag had written on photography, and on and on and on. And women were taking up the camera in a big way. And you can see it in Melanie Howard's work when she gives the camera to her male colleagues and what happens there. So this debate is happening in the art world, in the alternative art space, is being written about critically, and artists are starting to get going with repositioning themselves in relation to how meaning is made. That's a close-up from, and you can see she's working in her studio, she's photographing herself, she's then rearranging and creating collages on the page, and these are in the installation. You would walk around these pictures which were on the wall and also hanging on small thin wires, and so they would move as you walked around and so on and so forth. So okay, right. So in the UK and in America, the shift's also happening with Mary Kelly, and who's American but lives in the UK, so gets confused as a UK artist, and Cindy Sherman, who's making her untitled film stills by this stage. So there's a big shift that happens in the mid-70s when scholarship and representation kind of comes together, and there are key texts like Laura Mulvey's male gaze essay, which is called Visual Pleasure in Narrative Cinema, which comes out in about 75, and Juliet Mitchell. There's a kind of triumvirate of artists and critics at this time, and Juliet Mitchell's there with a book called Psychoanalysis and Feminism, which really makes a lot of change happen in relation to the female body. And Mary Kelly starts making her postpartum document in which was from 73 to 79. Cindy Sherman starts making untitled film stills. It's all about the representation of women from different points of view. So again, Rapp, these details. So in early 80s feminist art theory in Australia, we see this shift which has happened from a 1970s brand of cultural feminism, celebrating women's difference, for example, their biological difference, which also stressed the importance of equal opportunities in the museums and so forth. Cultural feminism was very big on statistics and sought to, unearth details about neglected women artists and so forth. And it shifts from that kind of focus to a more sophisticated analysis of the gaze and representation, which is being informed by psychoanalysis and semiotics and So Laura Mulvey's critique, of course, is seminal in this regard and was taken up by a generation of feminist scholars and practitioners. Every university student has read it ad nauseum, and if she hadn't done anything else and only written that, she'd still be very famous. So Julie Rapp came of age in a feminist scene that was under radical revision internationally. This photo series, Disclosures, is an example of a visual artist's analysis of the gaze and the framing of the female body within the canon of art history and feminist thinking. So it's a very sophisticated work. It was shown at Central Street Gallery to coincide with the Biennale of Sydney. So here's an artist that didn't get chosen to be in the Biennale, so she sets herself up to get the Biennale audience to come to see her show by having a show at the same time in Sydney at Central Street. So interventions like that are very important. So what Rapp's installation provided was a very controversial response both to neo-expressionism, which was very hot in the market in the 80s. It was, glorified as the return to painting, and it was important, surge of painting in the 80s and the 90s. So this was a retort to that. Also to the new kind of pop appropriation-based postmodernism that was being really celebrated in Melbourne via Paul Taylor's journal Art and Text, so it's also critiquing that. And what Rapp's work was also part of was a shift from fine art photography, like before Rapp and people like Cindy Sherman started to make museum-sized prints. Most photography was still 8x10 prints. So there's a shift, or it was either fine art photography or documentary. So there's a shift in photography as a medium where it becomes a more experimental mode of representation for artists. Before that time, it seemed to be I can't remember what Baudelaire called it in the 19th century, the handmaiden of the fine arts or something shocking. So this is important for women's art and feminism and the kind of momentum of focus that the work's going to have in terms of the critical ideas that are circulating in society. And a lot of women turn to the camera. Tracy Moffat's a really important protagonist in this. She's obviously also read Tracy Moffat is a very sophisticated speaker. I saw her in the 90s running rings around academics at a lunchtime forum at Monash University, and I was absolutely astounded by her knowledge of post-structuralism. It was just phenomenal. She was wiping the floor with them. So Tracy Moffat comes into this as an artist with Indigenous background to make something more, which she clearly prefaces the work in terms of what's happening in cinema studies, what's happening in photographic studies, what's happening also in critical theory in relation to racial stereotypes and female stereotypes and sexual stereotypes. And I think what something more does is also we start to see, and also Julie Rapp's work, we start to see a more performative approach to photography taking place, which is forecasting another shift in critical theory. So instead of the kind of just a semiotic kind of deconstruction of what's happening in the photograph, we get women saying, okay, so the Laura Mulvey thing was all about the binary. Woman is the object of the gaze, man is the maker of meaning. Woman is always in the subjective position, man's always in the active position. So it was a very good analysis and it showed us where we were at, but like so much structuralism, it was just telling us, it was just kind of unpicking in a sophisticated way why we were thinking like this. And for artists, this was difficult because it was then taking how do you, if we go back to the other work that was so significant at the time, this one here, thanks for the pointer, Mary Kelly's postpartum document. There's no bodies in postpartum document. It's a 7-year project or something about her relationship with her infant son from his birth till his comes into speech at the age of 5. It's a really heavy-duty Freudian, Lacanian, psychoanalytic analysis by the artist. You know, it's not some theorist doing the theory talk, it's the artist herself. But there's no representation of the female body. And what Cindy Sherman, Julie Rapp, Tracy Moffat are doing is saying, well, hang on, how can we represent the female body? How can I represent myself even if woman has to be taken out of the picture completely because it's too difficult to put her in the picture, because if you put her in the picture, she's always going to be the object of the gaze. She's always going to be in the underprivileged kind of position. So how can woman get agency inside representation? And this is the beginning of performative theory. So it takes that very political binary and tries to find agency for the subject once again. And what it also does in its talking to critical theory is it allows, unlike the celebration of female difference, for example, like the central core imagery, the celebration of the biological, what it says is, in actual fact, that's performed, right? We actually perform our stereotypes. Performance theory argues that we put on our gendered identities. We can put them on and take them off. Now you can start to see how we get to LGBTQI+, if we start to look at the social construction of identities. It frees things up so that the binary, all the greyness in between the binaries, is open if we go for this particular way of seeing and thinking about things. It has its problems as well, but this is again something from something more. There's a panel of about 8 images which kind of undoes the stereotype of the black and the white woman, beer swilling ochre in the background. It also undoes the gender thing. It points towards sadomasochism. It points towards a relationship between the women, perhaps. It's doing all sorts of things that you wouldn't expect to happen in one sequence of photographs. Okay. And it comes out about the same time as she did Night Cries, which is a small short film that won lots and lots of awards. I'm not going to... this is postpartum document again, where the woman is completely, you know, a huge feminist analysis, but the woman is never, ever represented in postpartum document, even though it's about the experience of mother and child. No represent. This is his dirty nappies, his scribblings, her Lacanian analysis, on and on and on. This is an iconic work of this particular feminist art position. So these theories of the performative, what have we got next? Okay, we'll go to that. Really opened up the reductive logic of people like Laura Mulvey, as artists started to respond in a more performative kind of way. It also shared a bit more, it also opened the door to French feminisms, which have been talking in different ways about feminism, and that kind of the American feminism was waning, and a more European feminism was coming on board. Much of this was put on the agenda by people like Elizabeth Gross, who subsequently, ironically, moved to America. And people like Megan Morris, and they did the huge Future for project in Sydney, where you had a lot of this kind of French Marxist structuralist stuff going on. Now then, I've run ahead of myself, right. So there's a kind of legacy, how are we going for time? Okay, there's a kind of legacy with performative theory that goes back to earlier performance art with people like Anne Abramovich, who I'm sure you all know about Marina Abramovich by now. She's become incredibly well known with her artist's presence at MoMA. Apart from anything else, she came out here also a couple of years ago. And this is Australian artist Jill Orr. So there's a legacy that goes, or that within the performative work of the film and the photographic work, there's also this legacy of the performative in performance, from performance art. And what my point here is that by the 1990s, feminists are starting to retrace their steps from this kind of performative position back into the body. So the body comes back on the agenda in a strange kind of way from this performative theory. Once again, the woman's body is back on the agenda, and people are starting to look back to this legacy of performance art. And they're doing so through screens of French feminist theory, people like Julia Kristeva, who writes about the abject and all the kind of taboo that goes with that. And starting to look at why has women's body been taken off the agenda? Is the female body taboo? You know, all of these kind of things are coming back out through these theories of the abject. You know, is it so that the feminine or the female is evil and unclean and outcast at the same time as she's mother, nurturer, mythological heroine? All of these older arguments are coming back through French feminism. This is Maria Kozik and Deborah Kelly Deborah Kelly is making a queer statement about Maria Kozik as bitch. Maria Kozik as bitch is a billboard that was put on in the 90s, one of the Biennale projects in, I think it was 1992 actually. And it was up all around, it was in Johnson Street in Fitzroy and places, and the talkback radio was going ballistic because, you know, this is meant to, here we are at the height of feminism. Everybody knows about feminism by the 1990s, it's been in the university for decades and decades, and Maria Kozik is coming up with this girly calendar thing on a billboard. So talkback radio and all the shock jocks were going ballistic about how anti-feminist this was. So you've got all these very conservative people writing in and saying this is disgusting that a woman's doing this. It was quite funny. And Deborah Kelly's doing it in one of the Mardi Gras projects in Sydney. It's a really good example about the representation of the female body and what the female is allowed to do. Like, she can't reduplicate that stereotype, not as fine art. It's a very kind of postmodern kind of work. Okay. So I think that where we're at by the 90s, but especially by the late 90s and then into the 21st century, is to admit that feminisms, this is Lady Gaga and Madonna, obviously, that feminisms had a very powerful impact on the international scene, really, in recent decades in the, not just the Western world, but, you know, primarily in the Western world. There's been this huge stream of exhibitions, starting probably with Inside the Visible, which came out of France in 1997. It was the first blockbuster kind of feminist women's show that actually came to Australia. None of the other ones have come to Australia, but Inside the Visible went to Perth, of all places. But the ones that we know of more recently in the 21st century are WAC, Art and Feminist Revolution of 2007, which was on the west coast of America, Global Feminisms, New Directions in Contemporary Art, which was global, by Maura Riley, and again in 2007. And in Europe there was Fusion Cuisine of 2002, Post-Feminist Positions in the 90s and again in 2000, Elle at the Centre Pompidou in 2011. All of these have produced huge catalogues, have been very influential since their time. Of course, in Australian women have been experiencing a very dynamic phase at the moment, with a renewed interest in art practices with a feminist bent from a younger generation. Julie Ewington curated Contemporary Australia Women at JAHM for 2012. Countess is still going very strong. The Dinner Party's been remade several times in different inflections, including in Australia. And of course in 2020, the Australian National Gallery, at long last, does their major exhibition, Know My Name, which sought to redress that terrible statistic of 2019 that you saw earlier, where they've hardly got any women in their show. In fact, Know My Name was chock-a-block stacked full of works from the National Gallery of Victoria, GOMA, Art Gallery of New South Wales. Very little of it, when you read the tags, are actually coming out of the National Gallery of Australia. So I'd argue that a lot of contemporary visual art practice is informed by feminism, but it's rarely espoused in those terms. We can look at quite a few male artists and go, oh well, they've read feminism. You know, they're doing the same thing. They're picking up on the same critical theory. As I was talking to a curator in Sydney, I won't name him, quite a well-known curator in Sydney, when I was starting to do research for the book, and I was talking about the gaze and postmodernism and all that kind of stuff, and he said, postmodernism was feminism, Anne. Or feminism was postmodernism, which I thought, oh, that's interesting. Not sure if I agree, but I think it's interesting that it was on his lips. So feminism, we could argue, has been one of the most durable political, ethical platforms of the 20th and 21st centuries, and it's so much so that we now speak of first, second and third wave feminism and its impact on society and on academic scholarship throughout the world. And in the US, they have a fourth wave, which is stresses a theological understanding amongst women, not sure about that one, while others stress an ethical activism that women pursue in a traumatic world. That's considered to be another fourth wave. So, of course, feminism has had its backlashes. Again, you know, where feminism is been heavily criticised for various reasons. Not only, we could also say it was too pale. Feminism's definitely been too pale in the Western world, and it's often shifted its position. So in 2010, Camille Paglia, who was a controversial US post-feminist or anti-feminist, was a supporter of Madonna, but she then critically attacked Lady Gaga, who's arguably, you know, also a Madonna of the 21st century. So, you know, you see critics themselves turning themselves inside out about different positions. I think we're going to have to end soon, are we, Charles? What time are we ending?
Yeah, soon.
Soon? Okay. I think I've nearly finished. So I just wanted to kind of finish in relation to these waves of feminism that have impacted upon us, to say that, you know, we could look back through maybe the last 150 years and seen various programs of feminism trying to unite women. But it's never really worked as a strategy. In today's world, women make up approximately 49.6, I think was the latest statistic, of the world's population. And although they have similar bodies some of the time, gender across culture is interpreted quite differently across the world. So being of the same gender is not necessarily the salient uniting point that the first and second wave feminisms envisaged. Class, race, ethnic background and sexuality are big identity tickets that sit alongside gender. This became clear in Australia during the 80s and 90s when Indigenous and immigrant women criticised feminists for excluding them. In the arts, the idea that artists can represent female experience as if it were a uniform experience, think of central core imagery, is now highly problematic. The issue is about who speaks for whom. And I think we're very aware in our own culture at the moment and across the Western world that we are living amidst an explosion of identities politics, and everything's pluralised, and there's an explosion of difference, which is fantastic, but also problematic in various ways. So I'm just going to flick through this. This is Diane Jones redoing some of Max Dupayne's work. So during the second wave, for example, of feminism, well-meaning white middle-class artists who created images of immigrant women at work in factories or engaged in domestic labour were accused of speaking for the other, you know, who speaks for whom, while immigrant artists were finding it difficult to be recognised. An Indigenous feminist, Aileen Moreton Robinson, who's a magnificent writer, she wrote a book in the late 90s called Speaking Up to the White Woman that was just really worth reading. She reflected on global feminist critiques of difference, and she observed that in Australia, whiteness remains the invisible, omnipotent norm. And for Kate Pritchard Hughes, one of the major strengths of feminism is to reassess not only the frameworks that concern it more broadly, but to reflect on itself. And we've seen feminism go through these waves. We've seen it critique, and I've only just really touched on some of this, but feminism has taken itself apart from inside and repositioned itself in various ways over the decades. Having said that, I'd just add that feminism is a political and a philosophical position that is multivarious, and as Leah said earlier, I no longer believe that it's gender specific. I think men can take up a feminist position, and I think we should encourage them to do so, and I'd wonder why they wouldn't, and that gender itself has become a matrix with transsexuality and intersex identities, making us question the natural order once more. And I'd argue that as we move squarely into a post-human world with all its political and philosophical complexities, feminism provides an ethical way of being and doing that we might embrace. And I'm just going to, because Nassim is in the audience tonight, I couldn't not get to this slide of her fantastic work, Erasure, from 2010. Where we see a woman writing on a chador, and in the video version, another hand of another woman comes and erases it. And I can't tell you the whole story, but it's a very, very poetic, political work that gets across a very nuanced, I think, representation of women today. The other artist I wanted to include is S.J. Norman, who's an Indigenous an artist with Indigenous heritage, and they created this work for Take This For It's My Body, where they put small amounts of their blood into dough, which they made into bread and asked the audience to eat the bread after signing a disclosure that said they were ingesting the artist's part of the artist's body, or it's a blood issue, isn't it? She's recently, when I wrote about SJ, she hadn't changed her gender identity at that stage, so I keep slipping up. But they have written a book recently called Permafrost, which is a collection of short stories, and I put it on my neighbourhood book club recently. It's quite conservative, some of the people in my neighbourhood book club, and it rocked them. I really do suggest you read S.J. Norman's Permafrost. It's a really good read. And then I'll just go to one of my other favourites, Eugenia Raskopoulos remaking an artist from a Greek background, where she's using her nonna's rolling pin there to roll out the oil, and she's winding thread, and the microphone's in the thread, so the soundtrack is quite coarse, and she's rolling the rolling pin of the oil, so she's naked and she rolls the body shape out of the oil. And then this is Amos Gebhardt, I never know how to say their name. There Are No Others, which was a video installation, firstly at Gertrude Street, when it was still in Gertrude Street, where you walked in, there was kind of 5 walls, a ceiling walls, and all these people. They've been jumping on a trampoline, but this was the transgender community basically bouncing up and down for us all to see. I'll just end by mentioning Rosie Braidotti, because I mentioned her before, and I've gone through from Mulvey through performative theory, and what's happening now, I guess, is the social construction of gender and gender identities is being looked at again as feminism looks again at its positions, and theorists like Rosie Braidotti and Karen Barad have put up new materialisms as a new way of looking at the world, again through embedded theory, especially the sex-gender divide, and all of its crossings are pertinent to new materialisms, which at its most radical embraces sentience across species and the natural environment, so rocks feel, and opens feminism into new critical dialogues, and at the same time references the past through histories of ecofeminism. Just end on Gillore's Antipodean epic, the salt lakes up around Mildura, as a kind of echo work. And welcome your comments and questions.